make us happy.
Good. All right. So I think moving forward, what we will do then is I'll leave room for you guys to write some questions down to get answers for, but also leave it up to, because what I find to be more beneficial is for you guys to really be wrestling with those things. You're going to learn much more by actually wrestling with whatever the Holy Spirit is trying to guide you in. And then we can kind of flesh that out here. That will be kind of the main focus. To put some biblical understanding today, before we jump into your questions, I wanted to kind of paint a picture of, or ask a question, then paint a picture of what I think might be helpful for us, particularly in the study of ancient Egypt. So the author here has multiple times throughout the book, course of the book, will talk about things like how ancient Jewish culture or tradition or Christian thought was shaped by Egypt. So let me ask you this question. Would you agree with that, the author's assessment that what we know from biblical history was shaped by Egypt, or would you disagree with that premise?
I don't understand the question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so was basically kind of, to boil it down, did Egyptian history go first, and then biblical cultural history borrowed things from ancient Egypt? Or do you think that that's true, or do you think that that would be a false statement? Because the author alludes to it a few times here. His thinking is, based on his study of ancient Egypt, is that Jewish culture in particular borrowed pretty heavily themes from Egyptian history.
Well, I think in some of the scriptures, like, we already see that Egypt was already a thing, and the Pharaoh was already there, you know. Jesus was around, and I think that, like, some things might be a little similar, but I wouldn't say that they borrowed from the Egyptian culture, because I feel like they kind of wanted to be separate from that. Maybe they did, like, kind of inherit some things from that culture, but I think they were trying to be different in the way that they interact with each other and stuff.
So you would disagree with the basic premise. Okay, good. Other thoughts?
I would agree with that. Yes. When the Israelites were in Egypt, that's where basically all the Jews were, and the Israelites who became God's people all came from Egypt, because they were all in slavery there. And they definitely carried Egypt with them in the desert. And even though the ones who did make it to the promised land, maybe they didn't. Maybe they had come out of Egypt, and physically and in their hearts. But I think from being in a place like that for that long, you kind of carry a certain way of life that was maybe came from Egypt. It's not the same as, but it came from it. It's basically off of it. Obviously, they're not of Egypt. They're God's people, and they're not Egyptian in lineage. But I would say it's maybe not all of it's from Egypt, because it's not. But I would say, yeah, I think some of it is borrowed from Egypt.
So pretty heavily influenced from Egyptian.
I would
I
agree.
think the key is to define what is being influenced. So that's the key. So
Yeah.
So worship God, that is very core for the real question, if you will. So it's the idea of God, the worship of God.
Yes.
That's, as a lifestyle, certain taste as inevitable. So we organize themselves even maybe, influenced by them.
Yeah.
But I don't know which will argument here. So
Yeah.
I think I'd read the book to allow me to have a free conversation.
No, that's good, and we're going to touch on that in just a minute. So Esther, you were going to say
Well, I
something.
actually agree with what Elijah said a lot. But I also feel like Egyptian history could have borrowed from biblical history instead of the other way around, because of the way they had gods and stuff and ruled entirely over people, but yeah, I'm not sure.
Good. It's a fundamental question when we're being instructed in history to ask ourselves this: when did history start?
I would say when it's recorded.
When it's recorded. Okay, so what is then the question would be, what does it mean to be recorded? Written down?
Yeah, like documented or remembered.
So if that was the case, then we have thousands of years that we disregard because the Bible, for example, wasn't written down until years and years and years after oral tradition. And so, again, the reason I want to bring this up is it's very important for us to have the proper understanding of history, because we do have a tendency to have a more modern mindset. And I think that, things that are written down help us, certainly much more so than at times some oral traditions. But even oral traditions eventually were written down. But long before, we see that with the Egyptian culture, right? It was the hieroglyphics that gave us some context to what was really going on in the tombs. But there was a history that predates the written word, hieroglyphics, all of that. And so for us to have a proper understanding or exegesis of any kind of historical document, we need to understand that our historical perspective doesn't begin from a biblical worldview when writing occurred. It predates that. Our understanding of history doesn't even begin when in Genesis 1:1 it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Right? So we understand that the historical understanding of the physical world as we know it, but our history, the way that we understand and interpret history, goes even further back than that. And John, who writes his gospel, talks about that, about Jesus. In the beginning was the Word. And so having a proper understanding and how we flesh this out, and I'll get back, I promise you I'll rabbit trail back to the original question here, means that we understand that our history predates even the creation of this earth as we know it, because the Spirit was moving, right? Father, Son, Spirit, eternally there, right? And so everything, if we understand the source as being Father, Son, Spirit, perfect in harmony, and then God creates things, right? Then we understand that every historical thing that has happened has a beginning in God. Now, to answer the question, I think you guys all answered it pretty correctly. The answer is yes, Egypt heavily influenced the people around them. But when we understand Egypt's struggle with even coming at some level of understandings of their own gods, where are they borrowing from? They're borrowing from the thread of truth that weaves itself throughout all of humanity, all of mankind. And so this is true of Aboriginal peoples that had never been exposed to the idea or the concepts of God as we would know him. We see very much similarities throughout all of the continents and things that line up. Why? Because there's a spiritual working that's going on in the midst of all people. There is then a struggle for us to know and to understand and discern who God is. And that's taken on many different forms. Egypt has a very particular form that they take on. And it's hard to notice when as we're going through it, because we're just inundated with a lot of information that is unfamiliar. But I wanted to talk about this concept, and then we'll answer your questions, or give you this concept. Egypt represents for us a counterfeit culture. What do I mean by that? Egypt borrows heavily in their understandings of creation and everything from a biblical worldview. And so the Egyptian culture far more so is influenced by the true understanding of God. They get it wrong, though. It's a perverted and twisted interpretation of what is right and true. Now we saw this, did we not, when we talked about how Pharaoh or the kings of old would define themselves as the truth. And so if the Pharaoh thought it was true, they were the absolute truth, right? And we compared that to Jesus, who said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, right? And so we see that what we find when we study Egyptian culture is not, let's clarify what it is not. It is not the beginning culture of the earth that we should take note of, and we've evolved from there somehow. That's a secular worldview. And so the author has that perspective to some form or fashion. And we see certain, sort of kind of answer that question of like writing. We see writing go back much further in Egypt than we do in other places. But that doesn't mean that Egypt predates other cultures, right? That would be foolish for us to say, because over time things break down, things pass away, things are no longer known about. For an example, if I asked you this question, how well do you guys know your grandparents? Would you say pretty well? You kind of have a basic structure outline of their life. You kind of know their upbringing, where they came from. So you've got a pretty good... Now, how well do you guys know your parents? Historically. You got a much better perspective of your parents, right? You have a lot more lived-in experience. How well do you know yourselves? Well, you've lived with yourself your whole life. And so those are three different generations, right, represented. Now, let me ask you this. How well do you know your great-grandparents? So your grandparents' parents. How well do you know their story? Fairly well? But probably not as well as your grandparents, safe to say. What about your great-great-grandparents? Do you know their story?
You don't even know what their name is.
Right. And so history has a way of, in a very few generations, it will be lost. Right? My grandparents, my kids have some basic understanding, but they have no concept of who their parents were.
I don't even know my grandpa.
Right.
I believe that.
Yeah. And so history has a way of kind of winding itself down. And what we know from ancient Egypt is we have a lot of information, right?
Mm.
We saw, as we read through this last couple chapters here, again, a counterfeit picture that the Pharaoh now was being associated with light.
Wow.
And again, where does true light emanate from? It's certainly not a man on this earth the way that Egypt does. And so as we look throughout in reading this, to answer some of the questions, we don't need to over spiritualize everything. And that's not the point of the exercise. To look through the lens historically from a biblical understanding is to not read into what we're learning. It's to be aware that there's a spirit at work even throughout history, and how the Spirit of God shines His light in the midst of Egypt. Now, because they are a counterfeit culture and they don't understand properly, because, again, remember, their understanding of creation started with chaos. And if something begins with chaos, then what will ensue, what will be born out of that, will be a history of chaos. And we see that with Egypt, right? The rise and fall many times of Egyptian culture. When we see and understand the biblical worldview, when God creates, does He create out of chaos, or does God create with order? Right? There's a whole different understanding. And so why is the understanding of Egypt in its understanding of chaos a counterfeit? Because it offers up the very same imagery. It offers up the same imagery of there being a king of kings. We see that. It offers up the same imagery of there being a true light. It offers up the imagery of there being a way to living, a truth to living, and a certain style of life. It offers up the thought of life beyond this world. And so Egypt, and all culture, but Egypt being one of the very earliest ones that we understand, has a spirit at work in it that is counterfeit to the truth. Now, why do I want to make this a point, do you think? Why is it important for us to discern Egypt as being some type of counterfeit? It's not an easy question. Elijah actually already answered it for us. Because what will happen historically is that Egypt will come up against God's people. And God's people represent, although they are certainly, when we read the Bible, in error often, they represent a people whose lineage, whose beginning is traced back to the one true God. That is, culturally speaking, the only culture that understands from its inception who God truly is. This is why Israel's called God's chosen people, right? He reveals himself and they understand that revelation. And so we will see now, as we're winding down, it's important for us to have this perspective that Egypt and Israel will have this really great kind of wrestling back and forth. And we'll see throughout the biblical text, right, Egypt show up again and again and again. And what does Egypt always represent in the Bible? The world.
The world.
Yeah. A secular way of life. So if from the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and he put order into the world, is there another entity out there that we can discern and understand that from the beginning of now I'm talking about our history, the beginning of created history, was at the beginning trying to bring disorder or chaos?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right? There's a spirit at work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this spirit manifests itself really clearly throughout Egyptian history. If we're not careful, most people will read history just through an understanding of like, I want to know the culture, I want to understand and get some knowledge about Egypt, all the while not understanding or discerning properly that Egypt is counterfeit. There's not anything that is truly, that emanates from Egyptian understanding that is of real noble quality. Even the good things that come from it are kind of ripped off from biblical truth, biblical understanding, and a proper way of life. But throughout a lot of the culture, we see a total perversion of God's order and God's design for humans to interact with one another, for us to even pursue the divine and pursue eternal life, right? And so I want to make sure that we have that at the forefront of our minds as we're discussing this stuff, because if we don't, what we will end up having is a really good conversation about secular history that will leave little to no impact in our lives. It's important for us to understand, again, the spiritual influences that go on culturally speaking, because as we are pretty aware, one of the things that was born out of Egypt in a modern sense is propaganda, and how, even marketing. That finds its roots in how Egypt, how it controlled itself, right? How the pharaohs presented themselves as benevolent and wise and kind and loving, and yet, what were they? Did the pharaoh give a rip about anyone? Not a lick, right? As long as the pharaoh got all the money and all the food and all the wealth and could be established as far as how generations from now would look. That's a counterfeit, because that's, and a perversion, because that's not what God intended. God did not intend my generation to build a name for itself. This is something clearly that's being taught as well. What is the purpose of my generation? The purpose of a proper understanding of my generation is to leave something of value for the next generation. My generation will die out and will be forgotten. Your generation, right, is coming up, coming into its own, coming into your own understandings, trying to navigate the world, and you will either fall into the way of the world or a type of Egypt, or you will separate yourselves from Egypt and truly try to get like the Israelites did. Not just get out of Egypt, out of the world, but get Egypt out of you. Get all of the influences and inferences of Egypt. Because someday you will be responsible for the next generation. And your responsibilities as you, when you hit that season of life, will not be about serving yourself, but about laying your life down for the sake of that next generation. And if we do it properly, my generation does it properly, you will have hearts that are fixed upon that purpose, and it will be less of a struggle for you. So then your generation hopefully will be fixed on that purpose and teaching that to your children and their children to their children. And so I think that was a really elaborate way. And we kind of went really far down some paths away from what we're talking about. But
yeah, you tell them 20 years on.
Yes.
I don't think they were interested. They're only interested in Egypt.
Yeah. Well, we will live it,
Joking,
and to that point, we will live it out. You will either live an Egyptian understanding of culture, which is based in the world, or you will separate yourself out of it.
Yeah.
And I think this is why it was really important for us to discuss Egypt. In fact, I know Noah had suggested it, and it was a really good idea, but I think the Lord wanted us to really get some clarity on this. Because I sense, even last week, although we didn't technically have history class, what I saw was, my perception of it is, in many ways, the Spirit of God was working on our own personal struggles with Egypt and trying to get the worldliness, the secular nature or that carnal nature that we see pretty prevalent throughout Egyptian history out of our own lives. And we must be aware of that. It's really important for us to be aware of that. It's why we study history, is to learn, right? Going back to my original statement, those who fail to understand or learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Those who fail to learn from or understand history are condemned or doomed to repeat it. See, history is a great teacher for us. The Israelites knew this. That's why they wandered for 40 years, because they didn't learn from their immediate history. They were, and think about this, they were much more focused on Egypt than they were on the Promised Land. Why did they wander? Right? When they were on the other side, wouldn't it be better for us if we just went back? It wasn't, think about this for a second. Was Egypt all that good to them? Slaving away.
It's terrible life.
But there was a spiritual hold there. So, all right. I digress. Let's jump into to some of these questions. And so, first question, comprehension. Really light question, nice and easy question. Why were the foreign prisoners of war circumcised? All right.
Question.
Whose question is that? All right.
Well,
Well,
no, I'm asking you.
he's the teacher now. He wants you guys to answer for him.
Which chapter were we on?
We're on Google Docs. What does that mean?
Yeah, which chapter?
Sorry.
Chapter
13, 14.
Anyone have some thoughts? I mean, again, let's engage in the conversation not to try to get the right answer, but to try to have an understanding of it. And sometimes getting to understanding means we have to go down roads where we don't quite have the right understanding of it, the right answer. To get to the truth, sometimes we have to go through the what is not true, what is wrong, so we can anchor ourselves in.
Was it meant to be like in Egypt a bad thing to have that done?
Let's direct your attention to Elijah. So asking him for this part.
I don't think so. Not particularly. I think it was not a bad thing in Egypt, but maybe a bad thing to the person, because they did this in a sense to Egyptianize the foreigners, because that was a culture practice, actually, like we were just talking about, because circumcision is a practice of biblical history, which like we were just talking about, which the the Egyptians inherited and used as a sense of Egyptianizing themselves. So they did that to the foreigners, I think, to kind of disrespect them and also to kind of bring them into their own culture. But yeah, it actually adds up really well with what we were talking about just before. So interesting to see how the Egyptians did stuff with their culture and did stuff in battle. And I enjoyed this chapter, kind of going through the life of a soldier and that kind of stuff. So yeah.
So why circumcision? What does circumcision represent? Not the physical, so getting away from the physical conversation, but what is circumcision meant to represent biblically?
Clean, like clean, you're clean or holy, yeah.
Yeah, that we're set apart, right? That we are a people who are set apart. So there's a circumcision, and a circumcision means a what? A cutting away of, right? And so in the natural, there's a cutting away, but there's a separation. It's a separating out. And so how does then Egypt use circumcision as something that is counterfeit to its true meaning? Because the Egyptian understanding of circumcision is not a biblical understanding of it. And so there was, in part, a separating themselves out. So they would be circumcised to be Egyptian. You would go through that ritual. But why would they then do it to foreign prisoners, particularly foreigners who never were circumcised?
To force them to become who they were and what
It was to subjugate them to their power. It wasn't something that was done out of a desire or out of free will to represent a deeper spiritual meaning, right? Circumcision in the natural is there to give us context to a deeper meaning of circumcision of the heart, a cutting away of the old ways, the old life, the old pattern, right? And so Egypt takes something that was really for a set apart people, and then they use it kind of to their own aims. It was to say, well, I'm a true Egyptian because I've done that. But it was also, to exert their power and force over foreign enemies. And this was common practice in almost every culture. One of the things that you would try to do is force others to follow with your line of thinking. And so if I'm in Egypt, how do I control the world? Well, by people who would resist me, I would do things against their will and force them into subjugation. You see this really clearly with Israel, right? When Joseph goes in to Egypt and he rises to a place of prominence, right? Everything seems to be going really well for God's chosen people. And then it says what in Scripture? A couple hundred years later, they had forgotten about Joseph, right? They'd forgotten what truly had happened. And so what did the Pharaoh at that time do? He looked out and he saw, man, there is a lot of these people here, and we need to figure out how to kind of keep them under our foot, because if they rise up, we're going to have some trouble here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it, like you said, kind of how Egyptians were trying to force their way of thinking on the people? Is that kind of like how history is repeating itself now?
Yeah. Well, and think about, throughout history, how has that benefited mankind by forcing what one believes on others? I mean, let's even take a really pure, good thought. Let's look at the church and how it evangelizes the world. Does the church always do a noble job of evangelizing by telling people, like think of this thought? Maybe you guys haven't experienced it. Certainly was true in my generation, that you either need to accept Jesus or you're going to hell. Like, that's a pretty forceful statement, right? Is there truth in that?
Yeah.
Certainly, right? But what is and the goal is to get people to repent. But what does the Bible say leads to repentance? Does it say that the anger of God leads us to repentance? Yeah, it's God's kindness. There's a sensitivity to the Spirit moving that leads to true change, right? For you guys to change, to truly desire to change, does it not have to start in your heart, in a willingness? Like, you might get kind of forcefully told, like, you need to get it together, and that might be true, and you might resist that for a time. But yeah, to this point, throughout human history, there's kind of this idea that if we can just force people, then they will believe. And it's an effective tool because fear, actually, done a lot of studies on this, fear does a really good job of imprinting on the human psyche, and we then will live out of it. But if anyone has known anyone who lives out of fear, how healthy their lifestyle is, it's not healthy at all. Living in fear is not a healthy form or way to live. And yet so often, if we think about this imprint, this Egyptian imprint,
Yeah, our children don't suffer that kind of impact.
Yeah.
So mostly, like,
yeah,
you just gotta have good parents, so good people around you.
hopefully.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump to the next question. So really good question. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that, or Noah, did you have any thoughts to
Not for
add?
me, no.
Okay. So foreign prisoners of war were circumcised in order to subjugate them to an Egyptian way, right? We're trying to get everyone to fall under line with Egypt. And so the difference between God's way of kindness and love, not without discipline. I mean, discipline is a part of love, right? In fact, discipline is a major part of truly loving someone. But it's not discipline that is just heavy-handed without any affection, right? There's got to be a balance, truth and love, discipline and kindness, compassion, and at times directness. All right, so who was assigned to help lead a young pharaoh until they became of age to rule on their own?
That was mine.
That was somebody, I can't remember the names. It was his mom. Somebody's mom. It was a woman. I don't remember who it was, so I forget the name. So you'd have to tell me the name.
He's talking about pharaohs in general, not like particular pharaoh.
Oh.
Yeah, it wasn't just one person.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's who was assigned to help lead a young pharaoh until they became of age to rule on their own?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. I think Tim just mentioned that recently.
What's so funny?
What is so funny?
I just like let it go directly to someone's mom.
Oh, you're funny.
Was it your mom joke? Is that what?
Maybe.
All right.
Your mom.
Any thoughts on that? Not just who, but probably also maybe we want to reflect on why, because the who informs the why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is
Right.
more important.
Yeah, and so those are it's a good question.
I think it was in the second chapter that I read. I think it was Amenhotep 3 was done, or maybe
Mhm.
Amenhotep 2 was the young king,
Mm-hmm.
and that sparked this question. Like, I just was wondering if it was either, like Elijah was saying, maybe their mother or some, like the lower, I can't remember what you call them, like it's like the second hand people
Mhm.
that would help the pharaoh usually. Like, were they the ones that helped him make decisions?
The vizier.
Yeah, the vizier.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So let's think this through a little bit. So, as we are pretty well aware by now, most of the lineages were passed down through kingly order, right? And so it was generally passed down to the firstborn son. That's pretty common throughout all of history. But what happens when the pharaoh dies and the next in line is 8 years old?
Oh.
So let's ask this question. How old do you think you need to be to really truly be able to manage your own life? Let's have a modern
I'd say
understanding.
18.
18. You think 18? Is that what you really think? Or is that what you think you should say? I want an honest answer. I want, if you had your own choice, how ready would you be to to step out and say, I'm ready?
Honestly, I'm 18. I don't think I can handle that.
Yeah, right. You're all, no, please don't make me.
Yeah.
I don't number. Nobody believe me.
Okay, I want to hear it. Let's hear
Here,
3.
it. 3?
30.
Thirty.
Oh, I was like, what? 30.
Yeah.
I think like 20.
20. 20 is a good age.
You're coming.
Okay. So why and then let's say, why do we come to those ages? What makes it at that age? Why do you think 20 is a good age?
I just feel like you've matured more. Or like Emmanuel said 30, because I've heard around 30 and 40 is when your brain fully matures. So,
You have some life experiences with us, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, psychologically, what we know, tracing the patterns of the brain, is that outside of me and Emmanuel, you are all stunted because you're not 30 yet, right? Your brain hasn't fully developed, and it takes a lot to develop a human brain. But I would say this: and I asked the question. We're putting artificial numbers on it, but why would you want to have somebody who is mature help? Because historically, it didn't matter whether the vizier was influencing the child. If the child made a decision as king, what the child went with was to be done.
Mhm.
And so what is the goal then of having somebody there? It's to bring them into an age of maturity. See, in the Western world, we have a really kind of silly way of parsing out when somebody's mature. We have these imaginary numbers like 18, and to your point, right? Did anything change from when you were 17 to you woke up and you blew out some candles and all of a sudden all of the wisdom and knowledge ever of mankind just, flowed into
Magic
you?
happened to
Right.
Naomi.
No, it didn't. Likely, Naomi, what you've learned in the pattern in the course of your life is by submitting yourself to the wisdom of those who have gone before you, you have matured. By going through great difficulty, if you respond well, right? Because there's plenty of people who suffer, who don't ever arrive at maturity. The best example I can give of this is: has anyone ever heard of Viktor Frankl?
Nope.
He wrote a book, and I would suggest this for all teenagers to read, called The Meaning of Life. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish man who was held during the Holocaust. He's actually a really well-known psychologist.
Do you have that book yourself?
I probably have a copy somewhere. Yeah.
Already? I would like to follow.
Yeah, and so this was his premise. And so he came out of the Holocaust and everything that ensued there very emotionally stable. Most people did not come out of that experience emotionally stable, right? Because you were tortured and treated like the whole goal of that, in the same way to Elijah's first question, was to kind of break people down and treat them as much less than. Viktor Frankl said this. He came to this realization when he was captured, that the Nazis could take away his family. That's a pretty hard thing, right? They could take away his ability to eat. So they could take away food from him. They could take away water from him. They could torture him. And they could cause, all sorts of pain and suffering. They could even take his life. But this was a realization he came to. There's one thing that they cannot ever take from him. That was his ability to choose how he responds. Now think about that. How profound that is for somebody who was going through unimaginable hell on earth, watching family members being tortured themselves, like being starved to the point of death.
Pouring your heart apart.
And he came out of that emotionally stable. Why? Because he believed that he has, and this belief goes back to his understanding of God. He believed that we all possess within us control over our choices and responses. And that as long as we respond appropriately, then we would do well. And so what does it have to do with this question? Well, maturity is found not in arriving at a certain age. Maturity to lead, to be a good Pharaoh even, would be to have the proper understanding, right? And if you're 8 years old and you haven't lived real life experience, you haven't been trained in like tactical responses, how do we deal with aggressive, forces coming from the outside, like right now, if Canada decided to, float across and take Port Angeles by storm, many kids running around wouldn't have a clue, right? How to navigate that. Well, you might have to learn really, really quickly. But who would you go to if you don't understand something? Who do you guys go to?
An adult or someone you trust.
Somebody you trust. Do you go to different people based on their understanding of different things? Yeah, I would hope so, right? Wouldn't you want to find the best person, right? The expert in that particular field of understanding. And so, yeah, why would you would appoint somebody that would have to have some level of authority in the kingdom, right? It can't just be some guy off the street. It has to be somebody who people would still yield their power to. But you would also want to appoint somebody who is wise in their ways. A lot of times it turned out to be family members. And when we look throughout Egyptian history, we see kind of certain dynasties come to an end. A lot of times it's because there were child kings that had the improper leading of somebody who was supposed to be an adult. Because what the adult was looking for was not to help out the child become a mature and wise and benevolent king. The purpose of that person was to do what? To gain as much power as they could for themselves. It's a counterfeit culture, right? A culture that tries to present itself as the end is a culture that is doomed to fail. It will end with them. But a culture whose goal is to leave something for the next generation in the hope that the next generation will be better than their generation is a generation that will thrive and continue to thrive. Because what does that do? It causes within the hearts of those people this idea of I need to kind of engage in a different way. It's a difference between doing whatever you want and hitting a magic age, and I'm an adult now, I can do what I want, and somebody who says, I know nothing, and I need help. And so when they hit that magic age, to Naomi's point, when you're 18, you don't just suddenly have it all together. You say, no, there's still a lot of maturing that I have to do. At 46 years old, there's still maturing that I have to do.
Thanks so.
And quite honestly, and again, and I know we say this, and it sounds like a very old people say this all the time. Had I had the level of understanding maturity at your guys' age, it would have saved me wandering in the wilderness. Luckily for me, it wasn't 40 years.
Yeah.
But man, I'll tell you what, I don't want a year in the wilderness. Right? It's looking back to Egypt when I should be looking at the promised land. And this is the difficulty of adolescence, is that you guys are, as we talked about, you're right in the age of life where your brain is still forming. Your relationships
Your brain's forming.
still forming.
Yeah.
Yeah, relationships are forming. Understandings of all of those things are still forming. There's a level of being mature because culture says you're mature, you're maturing, but also a big sense of it that I still can't figure it out. I don't know what to do or how to do it. And I would say this, and we'll probably have to do one more question, and we'll move forward next week. I would say this, that it is incumbent upon you all to not sit in the I don't know what to do, but to take some level of action in seeking out people who can help direct you. Because it's one thing to say I'm not sure, and that's an okay answer. It's certainly okay to not know. It's a whole other thing to live there, right? There's a huge difference between God keeping you in a place of mystery and you ignorantly staying in a place of mystery because you don't want to move forward, because that's a mindset, again, that is controlled by what? Fear. Yes, Egyptian fear. Well, Egypt represents that, right? Fear. Yeah, it's an Egyptian mindset. So we stay paralyzed. Why? Why? Well, it's looking back. Think about that. The Israelites even on the other side of the Red Sea, God made them. It's a circumcision of sorts to pass through, right? To pass through, and yet they were still fearful. See, and so this is why it can't just be a physical place that we go to. It's not just a physical separation. There has to be an emotional and spiritual separation from the former way of things. And so, as you guys are navigating, to kind of give it more context here, as you guys are navigating your teenage years and the next steps of what am I going to do with my life, what do I want to do with my life, the hope is that some of these conversations are generating at least a baseline of like, how do I even make those decisions? How do I come to an understanding of what I want to do with my life? Well, the easy answer for you is, well, first, God knows. Certainly God knows. But God has placed people in your life to help you walk that path. And they may not know exactly where it is, because very, very few times do we have the answer. But there's people that have gone before you that know how to navigate the jungles, right? That know how to walk through difficulty or challenge, right? So we're seeking people who are more mature. Third question: why did the Egyptian warriors not wear shoes during battle?
That's fine.
Interesting. That is interesting.
Isn't that very interesting? It popped out really like I didn't really understand it at all, so I decided to look it up and kind of study it a little bit, and I found this. Someone said that they believed the land to be holy, and they thought out of respect it would be good to take their shoes off while they were fighting, to have like this spiritual connection to the land while fighting. But they only like wore shoes during like social occasions and stuff. I just thought that was really interesting, and that's the only really information I got out of it. But I didn't know if anyone else really understood more about that. Cause like I feel like you'd want to wear protection while you're fighting, but they decided to take their shoes off.
It was terrain as well around the region. Don't have a lot of rocks, so that always fall on dirt. I imagine David doing them there just barefoot doing everything. So I'm not so sure. They had to wear some sandals. So.
Well, let's think of the implications of that, right? So based on that alone, if they are a people that are truly saying that the ground is holy, right? What is the aim of that? Do you think that they're taking their shoes off is going to, in their mindset, win the battle? Are their gods, are they calling on Ra and Horus and all of those as some sort of like, right? It goes back to, I think that in that case here, superstition, right? It's a belief in something that is irrational that will help us win something that's rational. Well, we see this in the Bible, by the way. I mean, so this is a more ancient way of understanding things. The question we would have to ask ourselves is that something that was truly born out of, from the start, a understanding of God as being created order, or is that a offshoot or something that branches out from chaos or disorder? And to be honest with you, I don't have an answer. I've not studied that enough, and so I won't pretend to know or teach something that I'm totally ignorant of. Yeah. But I would kind of, the way that I would handle that question is not just looking for the facts, because I would trust that person has some insight into it that was probably true. There's probably, to Emmanuel's point, probably not a need in the terrain necessarily for that. Maybe sandals or boots or whatever in the sands and things like that would slow them down. So there's probably a more natural understanding of it. It could be there could be things, for example, like they just didn't have the materials for it. or they didn't want to, give their warriors, because we know Egyptian history. They had the pharaoh, like Ramses was really good for this, had his elite fighting force. They wouldn't get those from the Egyptian people. They would get conscripts from other nations, right? It used to be Nubia, and now they were getting them from like the Aegean Sea, and so like really very, very well-trained warriors on chariots. And so likely too, the commoner who was fighting in the battles, it wouldn't have been much of a thought. And so how I would wrestle with that is maybe just trying to understand the thinking behind that. Maybe put yourself in their not shoes for a second and think about like, maybe this would be a good question. In what ways do you have a strict adherence to your faith that at the face of it doesn't make sense? And so I may not be able to answer that question for you specifically, but how do we apply that question? Because there's probably plenty of times in our lives where we do things that are because they're traditions or they're beliefs that are rooted in not necessarily truth, but they're rooted in history and ritual. It's a ritual. And so how does that affect us? But really weird, huh?
Very weird.
Why would they do that? All right, well, I know we went a little bit over, I think, today, and we'll finish up the questions as well. I really just do want to encourage you guys. I'm very, very grateful and don't want to miss saying so for your guys' diligence in searching this stuff out. Because, again, I know this book is not light reading. It's confusing at times. It's hard to wrestle with at times. And I've chosen that for a purpose, because I want you guys to struggle through some of the texts. Because again, the goal is not for you guys to give me, or anyone, a conversation on, all of the kings of old in Egypt and all the dates and all the times. My thought would be, though, is hopefully you guys are much more able to wrestle with like the deeper spiritual understandings of Egypt and how it plays itself out, so that as you read the Bible anew and as as you look at the books of Exodus and or whenever you see Egypt crop up, you will have a context for this counterfeit culture that really seeks to do what? Always undermine God's people in many ways. And what's crazy, think about how God knows that, right? God knows all of history, and he has allowed his people to go into Egypt, and then he brings them out of Egypt. Even Jesus went to Egypt and came out of Egypt unscathed by it. And that was on purpose. God allowed Joseph and Mary to run to Egypt and for Jesus to return. And I think we miss that in Scripture, where we just go, well, what was that about?
Do you know what we studied this morning? You have no clue. Good for you.
So, I'm guessing you studied Jesus and his
what?
His early life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Read chapter 2 of my issue.
Oh, there you go. So there's purpose in all of that, right? So, I want to commend you guys, because what you're doing here is not what normal kids your age are doing, and trying to engage in questions that go beyond just understanding historical documents or historical understanding. I promise you that as you continue to pursue life from a perspective of trying to discern the spirit that is at work in it and what is going on in the moment, you will find that your mindset will be much more readily available to be matured than the ways of this world, which is the way of and the pattern of Egypt, a counter-cultural, counterfeit culture. So, good job. Keep up the good work. Thanks.
Thank you.
We did 12-12.
12-12.